Good morning. It is good to see everyone out on this nice, sunny Saturday morning. And nice and cool. It's cooled off even. And good to see you here. And thank you again for this privilege of bringing God's Word. I enjoy teaching it. I don't know that I'm the best teacher, but I certainly enjoy teaching God's Word. We were talking some yesterday about man's longing for Eden. The answer, as I was pointing out some yesterday, is found in Genesis and how man fell. We know the story in the Garden of Eden, and how that longing for the return, the restoration, seems to remain embedded in humanity. We emphasize a lot in theology and evangelical circles the fall of man, depravity, the inherited sin. But there also seems to be this inherited or innate desire for fullness, for completeness. This is not even in my notes, and maybe I shouldn't even be going here, but an interesting study is the word shalom. We sometimes have a habit. I heard someone the other day, a speaker, I was at a teacher's conference, and the speaker ended his speech by saying, "Peace out." And, we sometimes only think of shalom as peace, but it actually encompassed like the well-being of the whole person. And even more than just health-wise, physical, spiritual, emotional, just all around completeness. And that almost seems to be what humanity is longing for, this restoration of that wholeness, that completeness, that fullness. I ran out of time before I could talk about what was lost, so I'm going to take a little time this morning to talk with some of that before moving too quickly into the next section. But in this 4-day study, I'm looking at the word Eden, and we're taking a word, or a letter each day rather, and we're focusing on what that letter could mean. Yesterday we talked about eviction or exile. You notice that's kind of a cycle for humanity through the Bible. You find them going, they're in Canaan. Abraham is there, and then they go to Egypt, and they're exiled in Egypt for 400 years as slaves. Maybe a different reason. It wasn't necessarily because they had done something wrong, but it was part of God's plan. They get back to the promised land, and then after several years, they're exiled to Babylon. And that seems to be the way humanity works. And so it was in the garden, where man was there in the promised land, if you will, but there came this eviction when they ate of the forbidden fruit and were exiled or evicted from that. The D in Eden, I'm taking to look at the disappointment and despair that followed as man tried to fill or looked for the filling of that Eden, that restoration. The E, next E, is Emmanuel, and N is new creation, and we'll try to take some time to deal with those two the next 2 days. We're kind of taking a journey from Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and we'll talk about some other verses in Genesis this morning, but that's our focus. And then later we will look at Revelation 21 and 22, as we see Jesus as the great restorer. To me, the eviction or exile from Eden is one of the saddest verses in the Bible, where it talks about in Genesis 3:24, where it says that God drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword, which turned every which way to keep the way of the tree of life. That Hebrew word that we've translated as drove is a strong word. It's a word that means forceful banishment. They They were not led out gently and sweetly out of the garden. It was a forceful, a strong, drove them out. It was also a severing of the relationship in many ways between humanity and God. It shows the seriousness of sin, the seriousness of disobedience. As yesterday we talked about how man tried to, instead of taking God's way, took his own way. And it shows the seriousness of it, the loss of sacred space. The tragic rupture, I already talked a little bit about that, between the relationship between God and man. It brought about many things. Some of the results of the fall I want to talk about this morning as we go through here was their loss of innocence. If you remember, before this time, they were in a period, in a point where they were not clothed. The Bible uses the word naked. There was no clothing on them whatsoever, and yet they were not embarrassed, they were not ashamed, they were not impure, it was not immoral, it was not wrong at all. But as soon as they ate the fruit, that's one of the first things they noticed. It doesn't say anything about them suddenly feeling pain from a thorn or a splinter or, it doesn't say anything, but all of a sudden they recognize their immodesty. They recognize their shame. And the Bible says that they tried to cover that shame. They tried to fix their own problem. We do that a lot, don't we? But it doesn't work. We try to fix our own problems. Adam and Eve, and by the way, that is a great start. If you're wanting to teach or preach on modesty, I know, we like to focus on the sacrifice that God made for Adam and Eve, but do you know the Bible doesn't say anything about a sacrifice for Adam and Eve? But it does talk about God making clothes from the... Now we assume that animal that was killed to make them clothes might have been used for some type of sacrifice. But the Bible doesn't say anything about that. But it does say God made them coats. Very foundational scripture for modesty, if you want to start somewhere. But shame entered where there once was innocence, where there was a time of complete unknown of anything wrong or immoral. And now all of a sudden they're in this place where there's shame. With that shame, with that attempt to cover, there came a hiding from God. Again, that separation between humanity and God is showing itself clearly. We assume, again, the Bible doesn't necessarily say this, but we assume that it was common for Adam and Eve to hear God's voice in the garden. We don't know that for sure, but we assume that. But at this time, when they hear God's voice walking in the garden at the cool of the day, Adam and Eve hide. And God has to ask, where are you? Where are you at? Not because God didn't know, but he was wanting a response. He was wanting them to return that. And then we see immediately following that blame shifting, where each one turned the blame on someone else. Adam blames Eve, Eve blames the serpent. Harmony between people began to be fractured. We assumed that before there was perfect harmony between Adam and Eve, and now that there is this disconnect, this difference between them. So that brings about God's decree of the curse. God brings the curse in verses 14 to 19 of Genesis chapter 3. The serpent was cursed above all the beasts. He was destined to crawl on his belly. You could go into a huge side note as what he was doing before that, but we're not going to do that. But he was destined to crawl and destined to be crushed. I love that even in the time of giving a curse, God is giving a promise, giving a prophecy. The woman was going to have an increase in childbirth or pain in childbirth, and there would be a relational struggle. Scholars have differing opinions as to what that relational struggle would be in verse 16, and we're not going to take the time to try to explain that, but there would be relational struggles between the man and the woman from now on. And then the ground would be cursed. There would be toil and sweat just to survive, to eat, to be able to make it. As a result of their disobedience, God gives this curse against Adam and Eve and the serpent. Life that before was not just leisure and fun. There was work. He was obviously doing some work in the garden. We don't know exactly what that entailed, but I assume that it was extremely fruitful work. That when he would plant something, there was no doubt whether it was going to grow or not. When he would prune something, it was never too much or too little. It was fruitful work. But now, as he goes to work, he has to till the land, and the land is hard and is not so freely to give the fruit that he's wanting. And it's work, toil, sweat, harder work than he's ever known before. But it is the only means of their survival. If they're going to survive, Adam and Eve are going to have to work. They're going to have to toil. They're going to have to labor. You know, I think, this is just an opinion. I can't prove this by the Bible or necessarily even by science. But I think a lot of our crying out for Eden can be seen in our thirst for creature comforts. We're looking for something to bring wholeness, wellness, comfortableness to us. One of the main reasons I love this tabernacle is its air conditioning. I sat in this tabernacle before, and I can remember what it was like. And you about wore, some people love it and miss it, and I appreciate that, but I still appreciate the air conditioning. I wore out my arm many days trying to fan myself, being so hot. Now, every once in a while, it might get a little warm when it gets crowded in here, but it's so nice. The padded pews, oh, my shirt used to stick to the benches. I guess we have a few hardwood, but my shirt would stick to the benches. I remember as a child, to those old wooden slat pews, and you'd try to get up, and you'd feel your shirt sticking there, and just we enjoy these creature comforts. Another reason I like the enclosed tabernacle is less bugs. Oh, the mosquitoes and all kinds of bugs. Some of you may know Brother David Preston. He's gone on now. He was a brother to John Preston, but as a child, I used to get so tickled at him. It didn't matter where we were. You could be in the middle of a hot, fiery sermon, and if he saw a fly or a bug or a bee, it was going to get swatted, squashed, or smashed. It didn't matter where you could be in the middle of lunch, and he was going to get that fly. Why? They were pests. They were a pain. And doing that obviously brought him some sense of satisfaction, but it eased a burden. It brought some sense of relief, some sense of joy, if you will. That restoration, that wholeness seems to be what he was longing for, looking for. You know, I really think many of those pesky bugs are part of the curse. Again, I don't necessarily have all Bible to back that up, but I don't miss having to swat or shoo away those mosquitoes and things while we're trying to worship God. You know, sometimes we joke, why didn't Noah kill those 2 mosquitoes on the ark? I don't know if there were mosquitoes on the ark, but you know, they're a pain. They're a pest. And I think it's part of the curse. The story is told of Mercurius of Alexandria, one of the early desert fathers, during the time of asceticism and monasticism, very many years ago. He swatted a mosquito and killed it, and he felt so condemned. He felt so bad, so penitent, that he took all his clothes off and went out into a swamp for 6 months, just to let the bug sting him and bite him. And when they came and found him later, they said he was unrecognizable. You couldn't hardly even recognize him. And now I don't think that was very smart or spiritual, but that's, I guess, beside the point. But the bugs, we're trying to find some relief from part of the curse, and that's just a little thing. There was a camp meeting years and years ago. Uncle Buddy Robinson was the evangelist, and at this camp meeting, they had a swarm of mosquitoes. Of course, they had it on the James River, which probably explains some of that, but swarms of mosquitoes. And they actually had to hire a couple of young men to fan Brother Robinson while he was preaching to keep the mosquitoes away. They're just pesty, awful, terrible things. And it's all a part of the curse, a part of the fall, a part of Adam and Eve and what they did. One person called them that they went beyond just flesh-biting, blood-sucking, pesty bugs. Even the ground was cursed. I already talked a little bit about that. And then death enters. Death itself brings its own sense of pain and grief and hardship that had never been recognized before. This exile, this eviction from Eden was more than just getting away from a nice, perfect garden. It affected every part of Adam and Eve's life and their descendants, even us today. There was enmity between man and evil. I love that even though the curse was given and Adam and Eve were driven from the garden, God was not beyond mercy. He was not beyond helping. And if you will, Adam and Eve were not even beyond hope. But there was going to be a groaning, going to be a time of suffering, if you will, a time of being away from Eden. 3 times Paul mentions this even in the New Testament. And he uses this word groaning or groaneth. In Romans 8:22-23, he says, "For we know the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now." Paul is saying even to this present moment. And in that is the inference that it will until Christ brings an end to the curse. And Paul continues, and not only they also, not just the whole creation, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body. Paul is saying our bodies are still under the curse until he comes and makes that change. Somebody used the theological term the other night of glorification. Until our bodies are changed into the likeness, that curse is lifted. 2 Corinthians 5:2, Paul says, "For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our house which is from heaven." I still don't fully understand that. But when I turned 40, I began to feel a few more aches and pains. And I heard some of those groanings when I would get up from a chair, or you kind of feel and hear those groanings already starting. But the body is groaning, it's travailing, it's in this earnestly desiring to be clothed with something different. Will you allow me this morning to call that crying out for Eden? That restoration of what was lost, of that wholeness, that completeness brought again. Paul again in 2 Corinthians, just a few verses later, he says, "For we that are in this tabernacle do groan, being burdened, not for that we would be unclothed, but clothed upon that mortality." And here he begins to get a little more precise of what part of that burden, what part of that groaning is. He says that for that we would be unclothed, but clothed upon, that mortality might be swallowed up of life. We groan in this life because we are mortal. We're facing a deadline. We're facing a point where life as we know it here will be no more. It will be different. It will be changed. And we're longing, we're craving, we're seeking for something different. There's a push, and I talked a little bit about this yesterday, a push in humanity to make that difference themselves. Some are using technology and science. Some are using cryo technology, where they freeze themselves and hopefully at a future time they can be unfrozen and brought back to life and cured of whatever ailment or disease they had. There's all kinds of things that humanity is trying to bring this wholeness, this wellness, this completeness back. But as we've found through history, all we are met with is despair and disappointment when we try to fix it, or when we become disillusioned or enamored with the wrong thing or the wrong person. Adam and Eve seem to have a sense that even though they had failed and failed miserably, God had a plan. God had something to help. Now, I know I've heard people talk that God wasn't even sure how this was going to go, how this was going to work out, that it was an experiment, that it was a trial, that God was seeing what humanity would do. But as I understand God, God already knew that God is all-knowing. And being all-knowing, He already knew. And God already had a plan. I had a professor in seminary who would stress, and if we even hinted that way, we would be severely rebuked, that this plan was not plan B. This was not a backup plan. This was not a second best. This was the plan. Now, you can argue theologically about that, but that was his opinion, and I'm prone to lean that way. God doesn't fail. God doesn't make mistakes. God is all-powerful, all-knowing. And using that, we can see that God had a plan. Adam and Eve had been driven from the garden. They're now adjusting to their new normal. They're experiencing things they'd never experienced before: pain, heartache, loss, grief, all of those things that before had not been there. And as God intended, creation begins to multiply. It begins to grow. And we find that what happens, this happens to Adam and Eve. As you find in chapter 3, verse 15, there's one of the most beautiful scriptures in the Old Testament. The very first prophecy we have of this plan. The proto-evangelium, if you will, they call it. It was the promise, the announcement of God's saving intentions, that He was going to do something to maybe not take them back into the Garden of Eden, but to restore the wholeness, the wellness, the perfectness that was before. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, right in the middle of the curse, when He's cursing the serpent, He says, "And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." Right there we find this first promise. Notice this comes to the first woman, Eve. It doesn't go to Adam. I find that interesting. God doesn't give the promise to Adam. He gives the promise to the woman. Why? Because the woman is the one that is bringing that seed to fruition, bringing that child into the world, bringing that into existence. John Chrysostom put it this way: the promise is that from her seed would come the promised one who would overcome the tempter of humanity. God didn't wait until Christmas to announce Jesus. He promised it right there in the rubble of Eden. As the Garden of Eden was being closed and blocked, God promises the one will come. There will be a deliverer. This was obviously something Eve takes very, very seriously. She takes it as something that is real and something that is literal, because we find in the very next chapter, Genesis 4, chapter 1, where it tells us, and Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. This statement, along with the meaning of the name Cain, which means gotten or acquired, seems to infer or indicate that Eve thought, this is the one. This is him. Here he is, the promise. Here is our hope, our help. Can you imagine if she really felt that way as she looked down on the child in her arms, knowing all of the loss they've just experienced, all of the pain, all of the things they've gone through already? And as she looks down and looks into the child's eyes for the first time, and she feels that joy that a mother feels, but along with that, a sense of anticipation. Here he is. This is the promise. This is what God is giving us. But we know that wasn't the case. Thousands of years later, another mother will look into a baby's eyes that will be the one, but not yet. In fact, Eve is met with a very grave disappointment. I can't even imagine the family meeting that took place when Adam and Eve found out that that man from the Lord had killed their other son Abel. I can't imagine the grief, the sorrow, the heartache, the loss, the broken, the despair that Eve would have experienced and felt in that moment. In fact, as I was studying this, in the back of my mind, I could hear Brother Lloyd DeVault as he preached a powerful message when I was a young person. And his words were, the apples were not worth it. And I could hear that over and over in my head as I was thinking of this part of the story. No, they weren't worth it, and all the hopes that she had in this little boy were gone. They were gone. Hope becomes horror. What have I done? What has happened? This has never happened before. The one who was to be the first deliverer becomes the first murderer, becomes the first killer. It's interesting that we only know 3 of Adam and Eve's children. Josephus says that Adam and Eve had, according to Jewish legend, that they had 56 children, 33 sons and 23 daughters. But that's Jewish legend. We don't know that. There was obviously somebody around when Cain killed Abel because he was afraid they were going to kill him. But we may presume it was Adam and Eve's other children. We don't know for sure. But again, that's Josephus talking and the Jewish legend. But we do know that there was at least one other son born to Adam and Eve. You can find that in Genesis chapter 5, verse 3. And Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth. And we find the Bible will now trace the line of Seth down through its pages. We go from Seth to Enoch. I'm skipping a few generations there. You understand. Methuselah, Lamech. And then we find an interesting verse in chapter 5, same chapter, verse 28 to 29, or passage rather, where Lamech lived 182 years and begat a son, and he called his name Noah, saying, This same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord cursed. What's he doing? What's Lamech saying? Saying, this is the one. Here's our deliverer. He's going to deliver us from this curse from the Lord. He will bring us comfort. He'll bring us hope. He'll bring us wellness and wholeness. But as you know the story of Noah probably better than I do, we find that even in Lamech's lament, the despair of generations had already taken its course. And by the time Noah became a man, the earth was so full of evil that God said, it's got to be destroyed. Man is going to just destroy themselves. And there came a place where God gave Noah instructions because Noah found grace. We do find that Noah was one who was obviously righteous in his day, and he lived according to what God wanted, but he was not a deliverer of all the people. Yes, he built a boat. Yes, he got his family on board, but that was it. The curse was still there. And then we see that humanity seems to take on a second creation, if you will. That as Noah left the ark and he and his family went out, that they had to start over. And life began again. And Noah, though a godly man, made some mistakes. And the curse was not lifted. In fact, in many ways, I would say it might have gotten worse. A few years ago, we were at the Grand Canyon. And I remember, I may have told this here before, I can't remember. But I do remember standing on the edge of the, I think we were at the South Rim, looking out over the Grand Canyon and just being overtaken with awe. And while I was standing there, that song, and I even hummed it kind of to myself. Everybody else had kind of gone on. I was standing there by myself and hummed it a little to myself. How great thou art. And I see all of these things. And then it hit me. This is beautiful. This is marvelous. This is amazing. But do you know this is actually because of sin? The Grand Canyon wasn't created like that by God. It was created because of, no doubt, the flood. Or the effects of the flood. And then I thought, God's even greater. Not that that's possible, but in my mind, my thoughts of Him went even higher. So that if God can take something so awful and terrible like sin and make something this beautiful and awe-inspiring and moving. I mean, I was in tears at the moment. And so moving, how wonderful He is. And God took what man had destroyed and taken and ruined and twisted and messed up by the fall. And He even took them through the flood. And out of that He restores or attempts. God doesn't attempt. But he brings about a restoration, if you will, of humanity. The curse is still there. It's still in effect. But He's given grace. He's given mercy. He's given hope. There's still a deliverer. There's still a promise. The line of promise seems to narrow. Noah and then Abraham. God calls Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah. Trying to hurry along here. David. David is a tremendous study. I know David had his faults. And some people look on David as a bad individual. And I understand some of the thinking, some of the thought process behind that. But God calls David righteous. The Bible calls David a great person. 2 Samuel is full of the stories of David. And in this story we find of David some tremendous truths. We find that David was a person who was unknown, a person who was in his father's sheepfold, tending to the sheep, and God brings him from that into a place of power. It's a long, lengthy struggle that I don't have time to go into, but he rises to power. Then he begins to reign over Israel. He brings the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. And then God makes a covenant with David. Now, sometimes we think this covenant was just between God and David, but it extended so much further than that. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, probably one of the most famous chapters in Samuel, we find where a tremendous verse in verse 13 where it says, "He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." And it records the Davidic covenant, God's promise to David and to David's descendants. And on past that and through that line, he will eventually promise, will come the one who will crush the serpent's head. He's the one. Up to this point, man has only been met with disappointment, despair, and disillusionment. But there's one coming. The promised one is coming. It even has a fulfillment, the Davidic covenant, in the kingship of Christ. Not just in David himself or his sons or his descendants. Three things that God promises David in chapter 7, verse 16. He says, "And thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever." So an eternal house, an eternal throne, an eternal kingdom. And David wants to build a house for God, a tabernacle, a temple, if you will, for God. And he has plans for that, and even begins to make action steps toward that. He's interrupted in those plans and told, since he is a man of war, a man of bloodshed, that he is not the one to build the house, but his son will. But it's interesting that David wants to build a house for God, but God's going to build a house for David. And this house of David is so much better than any temple that David could have built, or that David could have made, or even saved up for, even though he saved and prepared and made a way for Solomon to build the temple. David's house was going to be so much greater. In chapter 23 of 2 Samuel, we find these last words of David. I'm not going to read all 7 verses, but it says, "Now these be the last words of David. David the son of Jesse said, and the man who was raised up on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, and the sweet psalmist of Israel said, the Spirit of the Lord spake by me, and his word was in my tongue. The God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spake to me. He that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God." Skipping down to verse 5, "Although my house be not so with God, yet he hath made me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and sure, for this is all my salvation and all my desire, although he make it not to grow." David had said, he's building a covenant, a house for me. I can't build him one, but he's building me a house. David, a mighty man, a man blessed and used by God, a man in many ways a failure, but in God's eyes, that was the key. That was the next step. That was going to be even the designation of the promised one, of the serpent crusher. But he hasn't come yet. We get promises, prophecies, covenants, but he's not here yet. You go ahead many years, even after David, several years after King David, and you find Isaiah promising, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive." I want you to notice there's no mention of a man, no mention of the husband, no mention of a male having any activity or part in this at all. The promise was to the woman and to her seed. And Isaiah says, "A virgin shall conceive." Centuries pass. Israel waits. The seed is promised, but it's delayed. It's put off. They're waiting. There was probably many who were longing, who were looking. But disappointment and despair fills every one that they look to be the one. They're not the one. It hasn't happened. Many have taken the 4 weeks before Christmas to celebrate or to think about or reflect on this very thought. We call it Advent. And those 4 weeks, at least one of those weeks, is especially centered. There are different takes on what Advent means, but the most common one of those weeks is especially set aside, reflecting the hope, the waiting, the anticipating, the looking for, the longing for the promised one. The serpent crusher, the one who's coming. But so far, all we've met with is despair. Oh, there are a lot of good people. Seth, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, even Noah. I already talked about Noah. Even David. But all of them leave us disillusioned and in despair. But that's when we come to the next letter in the word of Eden. We've had exile, eviction. We've had despair, disappointment. Tomorrow I'd like to talk to you about Emmanuel, God with us. God's plan wasn't just to send a person, but to send the person, the one. The fulfillment is born. Thou shalt conceive, bring forth a son. He shall reign, was the promise. Galatians 4:4, Paul says, when the fullness of time. Hasn't been time yet. It's been time for despair, disappointment, disillusionment. But it's coming. And tomorrow we will talk about Emmanuel. Thank you so much for your good attention. God bless you. Have about 15 minutes before the next service.